I've been searching for the meaning of my life. And I've been searching for the meaning deep inside. They say I can find it somewhere out there. I know that's a lie.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to our series of lectures. This is the second in the series. The title of the series I've named Contemplating the Blue Orb. In the first series I spoke of my origin story, as I like to call it, and outlined a series of topics. I think there were 4 which I would deal with. Today's topic I have chosen, I think it was third on the list, but I've chosen to speak about it today because we are one day removed from the celebration, the acknowledged birth date of the Christ, and today's lecture will be about the Christ event. I will speak about it in terms of its origin, the coming of Christ, the mechanics of how it happens, and why it occurs. Why, for instance, we, as an animal, believe in a being called Christ. And it doesn't matter if you're Muslim or follow any particular religion, we are convinced that there is an agent within us, a being within us, who we acknowledge as the Christ, and we can identify within us promptings, points of views, actions which go and are a result of what we call and acknowledge as the Christ consciousness. Now, what is the origin of the Christ consciousness in us? I insist that it is innate to us. And it is a product of the kind of planet we live on, with its astonishing variety of life, and the fact that we are the dominant species. I think that the planet itself provides for the dominant species this level of awareness, which we would call the Christ consciousness, because as the dominant species on a planet with such an astonishing variety of lives, that dominant species would have to be innately tolerant, broad-minded. It would have to be able to give of itself so that it can oversee and take care of the other life forms on the planet. And if you think of Christ, this principal characteristic of that character, if I may, is what is called his love. And love, in the simplest terms, is an act. And it is the act of caring for or doing for someone or a living being when it is of no practical benefit to us. And I'd like to give an example of that. I'm sure you've seen it, particularly when you find a society or community in distress. You find this Christ character come into the fore. And it's, the scenes where someone is being washed away in a river, and you find people put their lives in danger to save that person. And not only with fellow humans, we do that with the dogs. We do that with animals. We would put ourselves in danger to rescue and to care for other animals and other human beings. That, I think, is the simplest way in which I can define the expression or the Christ consciousness within us, which finds expression in this willingness to give of ourselves and to care for and to take care of others for no other reason than we can, and we feel that urge to do so. That characteristic of us is extremely and extraordinarily important because it has resulted in an event in the life of the species which runs into the millions of years. I won't use the language proffered by science. I'm not a scientist. I do not follow that particular religion, and I want you to understand that when I use language, it is not referenced by science. So you might hear me say things which science might not approve of, and I say, so much the better. Every living thing on the planet, and indeed in the universe, is conscious. They may not be self-conscious, but there's a form of consciousness within every living being. And we can communicate at that level with animals, with plant life, with the planet herself. And we certainly can with other human beings and other beings who might be from other realms or physical places. During the life of every human adult, we will have an incident. And from that incident, we will have a particular insight. And that insight will help us and guide us to reflect on the fact that, there's something out there which is aware of me, I'm aware of it, and which seems to take an interest in my life. And it might happen that you have an accident and you feel, hold on a minute, how come I didn't break my leg? How come the car didn't turn over, or the car turned over and I have no injury? And these events happen in every human being's life. And it's extremely important because in the relative infancy of the life of the species, there were a group of men who began to wonder about that thing out there which seems to be aware of us. This group of men, in reaching out, made contact with that thing. Now, this group didn't meet in a conclave and vote. It was an entirely natural event where, when it gets to a specific number of people doing the same thing, it has an effect on the whole community. The whole community, in other words, was asking, who is that? And the men, I should point out, were for the most part creative men. That is, men whose consciousness, which is a characteristic of us, can leave our bodies and travel and return. That is a characteristic of our species. I actually want to point out to you, there's, I saw part of it last night, in fact, there is on YouTube a video of Seiji Ozawa conducting the Berlin Philharmonic. I think it's from 2009 or 2013. And he's conducting the Pathétique by Tchaikovsky, and as you may not know, it ends in silence with the double basses. The whole orchestra just becomes more and more quiet, and it ends the double bass doing pizzicato, which is the plucking of the strings. Boom, boom, boom. And you can hardly tell when it ends. And for about 45 seconds, the conductor, who is at the turn toward the double bass on his right, he's like this, in an almost catatonic state. And you can see him, as it were, wake up and come alive. This ability for us to leave our body and return to it is particular characteristic of all of us, but it is easier to do in men, and I suppose women who are creative. So you see musicians, artists, poets. It's a way of going into a trance, a controlled trance, as it were. I mean, when he was conducting, he was present physically, but spiritually he was someplace else, as would be most of the, if not all of the musicians. That's a profound and not often mentioned characteristic of us. Now, the thing out there that we wanted to know about is, in fact, a form of energy. This energy, I call it an energy out of convenience. That energy is self-aware. It has the ability to reproduce itself. It has fecundity. It has the ability to move into, as we can, into other beings. And it responded to us. It responded to that inquiry. And what it responded to in us was our Christ consciousness. So what happened was that the native consciousness of the species was then married to this consciousness, which is, for want of a better word, God. It is omnipresent. It can be anywhere at any time. It allows us to, as a consequence of that, there's several things which happen to our species. The direction of the species has changed. We can see more than we could, although we have the ability to travel outside of ourselves, the ability to travel to other planets and see what is happening there at this time or 2 million years from now is a direct result of the fact that we have, as part of our consciousness, this spark of the divine, this spark of source, of God himself, who lives within us. There's such a thing known as remote viewing, where you can train someone to view, and I've read several books of this, and one of the things that, I think his name is McConaughey, it was something developed by the US military or security state, not surprisingly. And they would give you coordinates and a time. And in the book I read, this particular guy was given coordinates on Mars 2 million years ago, and he saw what it looked like then. The ability to do that isn't because he was trained in remote viewing, but because he's human. And as a human being, because we have attached to our native consciousness, this divine consciousness, we can, like the Almighty, be anywhere we wish. If you would like to know what Andromeda looks like, what it's like to travel there, you can do so as a human being. And that is a direct result of this event which happened in relative youth of the species and which has transformed the species. You might then ask, well, Clayton, how come there's so much wickedness on the planet? Which is a question that people like to ask. They think of God as being this pure person. But one of the things that I know is that nature makes room for evil. Evil does exist. And because it exists and it's part of nature, you have to assume that nature makes allowances for it. I'll give you an example. It's common, fairly common in certain circumstances to ask why, when the horrors were taking place in Germany in the mid-last century, people didn't speak out. And I'll ask you the same thing, why, given the horrors and depravity we've seen coming out of the Levant, is there not people speaking out? I don't think that although hospitals and schools have been bombed and decimated, I am fairly certain that there hasn't been an organization of medical professionals or people who own hospitals or run universities raise the alarm in the United States or in other parts of the West, they're more likely to bludgeon young people who protest against the expression of that particular depraved lot of people. That occurs because, in fact, we have nature makes room for the existence of evil. We can and we do learn from it, but you know, it's part of, there is light and there's darkness. It's for us with our discernment and hopefully with wisdom and understanding, find that balance between light and dark. Nothing is ever all dark, nothing is ever all light. What I'd like to speak about now is the mechanics of the Christ event as it occurs now in the movement of the sun and its attendants, or its planets if you wish, as this flock of conscious beings go through its journey around. It does in fact encounter that form of energy, which let's call source. When it is approaching that source of energy, nature provides a handful of men whose consciousness is at a level where they act as an antenna to that energy. And the individuals, the handful of individuals, has to choose to accept that energy within himself. When that happens to that individual, the human body is not able to take that energy for any length of time, and what happens is that that energy will then, which is a form of light, I would say, refracts and goes into any number of persons anywhere on the planet. It's not limited by any physical. But people of light mind, of light consciousness would feel that awakening, as it were. One of those persons who the light refracts in then becomes the Buddha or the Christ, the person who is known. But the central character who the light came into first is never known. There's a letter written to the sitting emperor in Rome from his ambassador in Jerusalem, purporting to describe the Christ. We can be certain that it is, if not entirely a fraud, then something designed to guide our perceptions, and that happens. Or is it the teacher of righteousness? There were people in the Levant around that time who were filled with that light. But they would not have been the central character. They would be the person who the light refracted in and who was awakened by that event. We, as I say, are in the middle of that event. I can see and I can identify the effects of it, but I do not know if the cause has occurred. And basically no one usually knows when that event happens. So I've spoken of the origins of it. It's something which the Christ consciousness is innate to the species. It is something which nature provides us with. It's a responsibility. It's a trust. We are entrusted with it as the dominant species so that we can oversee with love. We couldn't be a predator who would destroy the planet. And as an aside, I would say the rhetoric about, climate change and so on is being promulgated by people who have taken upon themselves the thankless task of guiding human beings when they are singularly ill-equipped to guide us. The principal rules which guide and govern life on this planet are spiritual. And the people who are running the world lack the depth and height of spiritual awareness to exercise responsible custody for this planet. All of their plans will and ultimately will fail because they're following not an organic but a manufactured invective to rule and to dominate. And they can only do so by negative means, by deception, by violence, by, well, you know the story. I would say that one of the principal occurrences in the species, once the divine, as it were, came into us, was that in the species, men, the male, began to take an interest in the rearing of their offspring. Before it didn't happen. It was like, you know, you see animals on the planet, you know, the female gives birth and the child attaches to the female until it becomes an adult, a young adult. Men began to take an active interest in the bringing up of their children. And if you think of that, then that had profound changes on the structure of the family, because then men had to stay closer than they would have before to their children and the mother of their children. So that's one of the primary differences, primary things which occurred when we achieved this, I would call it enlightenment, when the species was married to that divine consciousness. There are other things I can say that has to do with the change of the direction of the species. It's a positive change, and I think what it will do is it will prolong the life of the species. We are several millions of years old, and we still have several millions of years to go. What science tells you about, you know, we were 300,000 years ago. That's, you can look in what might be called remote viewing and see what our ancestors, or those of us who are earthlings, if I may put it that way, see what our ancestors looked like 2.5 million years ago. And things that they were doing, practices they had as a community, which, interestingly enough, are still practiced up to this day. So I would say, excuse me, I would say that the Christ event, as I said, it's occurring now, and it is the most important characteristic of us. I mean, that's my bias, my opinion. I can go in and speak about what is happening in society today, where there seems to be a deep resentment against Christianity. But I want to speak a little bit to that, because you may find it helpful. Although I was brought up in the church, there was a time in my life when I didn't go to church, didn't set foot in a church of my own volition for maybe 30 years. And one day, maybe, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago, I called my sister and said, listen, take me to church today. And as it turned out, it was an Easter Sunday. I'd forgotten the Christian calendar. I attend church today, but I do so with an awareness I didn't have when I left. And that awareness is, people who are celebrating the fact that we no longer say prayers in school, that we know that church attendance is on the decline, and people scoff at church. I want you to understand that getting rid of the church, getting rid of Christianity or the institution of Christianity also means getting rid of its positives. Its positives are that it provides a context in which peoples of various cultures can find common ground. I know that when my parents went to Toronto in the late 60s, early 70s, when I arrived in Toronto, my father, within 2 or 3 days, we went to Eastbourne Baptist Church. My goodness, I still remember the name, where the pastor, Ray, and his wife, Cora Kershaw, ministered, and my dad would preach the last Sunday of each month there. If you get rid of the church as an institution, you would also have to give up the music it has given the world, the art it has given the world, the teachings of common ground. One of the things that struck me when I was in high school here, not in Canada, and we were talking about the abolition of slavery and those English politicians, it was the fact that they could appeal to Christian teaching, which says that we are all equal in the sight of God, as a way of ending that heinous practice. I remember speaking to a fellow worker, manager, when I lived in Toronto, and she was asking me, how come people from the West Indies, I think she specifically mentioned Barbados, seem to have a common outlook of some kind with her. She described herself as a 9th-generation Scottish Canadian. And I said, listen, we all went to Sunday school, so we all have a general idea of what constitutes proper behavior. We all have a common perception of what is right and wrong. And these are extremely important. When you get rid of the institution of the church and Christianity, you also get rid of that. And you have a society which is being torn apart. You give up the music. Are you prepared to live without soul music, which came out of the church, R&B, all the other sorts of music that came out of the church, the art which was produced by the church? There's never anything which is all good or all bad. And it's our duty, I think, or my duty, to find the balance between the light and the dark, and to strike that balance. So why does this event occur? It occurs, as I said earlier, when we're on a regular basis, and it's not every time that it occurs that it's such a powerful event that it produces a reality outside of the experience of the individuals who are having it. It does not always create a religion with its infrastructure and its history and its culture. It occurs either, as I said, regularly, where nature provides men whose consciousness acts as an antenna and so on, or when we make appeals en masse, as we did originally, and it answers. If the species is in a bind, as it were, either for physical, if the planet is impacted by, in some way, or the species is under duress, we cry out and we are heard. And it will respond. Originally, when it happened first, that is what happened. We were not under duress, we were curious. And it responded. And, not every time that we're under duress and we cry out, who shows up has our best interest at heart. And I will, in one of my lectures, I'll speak to the fact that there's a group on the planet which has or believes that it has an obligation to run the planet. And it is a product of such an event. When after a particularly destructive impact on the planet, a group showed up and offered to help us. Bit of advice, if you're ever in duress and someone offers you help, never accept it. The offer implies obligation. If someone wants to help you, and if you want to help someone, do it anonymously, so that they do not feel obliged to be bound to you. That is the system under which we presently live. And it has been going on for more than 10,000 years. But happily we are at the end. Part of what is happening on the planet is the end of that regime. And for me, it couldn't come a day soon enough. So, why it is happening at this moment, the Christ event is happening at this moment, because we are going through a change on the planet, and we are reaching out, asking for guidance. And we have been heard. Our prayers have been answered. And it is up for us to hear that prayer and to bring it to fruition. Another aspect of the Christ event is when it occurs, and this goes to the story, the Christ story as we know it. You know that there were several disciples and events. One thing I would tell you, that as a species, we record history as stories. Stories and their structure carry more weight, psychological weight, psychic weight than facts. We're not guided by facts, we are guided by stories. So the story of the Christ event, when you hear him, then he says it was a 12-year-old boy and he was in India and Mary Magdalene was his following and had his disciples. I contend that this is a portrayal in story form of the different people into whom the light refracted. So his disciples, the 12-year-old, the female followers, the tradition of him being in northwest India, these would then be persons in whom the light refracted and who were quickened, as it were, by that experience. And that is one aspect of the Christ event. I mean, we cannot know him outside of our own personal experiences, outside of us becoming Christ-like. One thing I would mention, there is a tradition on the planet where that event which occurred was regarded as a disturbance, as an interference in the order. There has been, in the long history of our species, contention between both consciousness. These people who regard the coming of the divine within us as a disturbance, they represent, there has been conflict, not conflict, but contention since then between both groups. And we see it in terms of light and dark, the struggle between light and darkness. I mean, that I think is over-dramatized. But there's always been a stream of consciousness on the planet of people who, although the Christ consciousness exists within them, have never accepted the imposition or the acceptance or the imbibing into us of the divine. I insist that what we are seeing in the Levant is an articulation of that struggle. That the people who ironically claim to be chosen by God, which if there ever was a lie told in our society, that is it. When you divorce yourself from the Christ consciousness within you, your actions perforce become destructive. It is the acknowledgement of the divine within us that acts as a guide and as a breach against behavior which is destructive. It's very interesting to listen to these guys speak about people who are not like them as being animals, and people who, what is astonishing is the level of depravity, and you realize it's because they represent a line of consciousness where they actively campaign against the divine within us. And what you see happening is an articulation of what I call revelation. I should mention one thing. Whenever this Christ event occurs, we usually move from one form of consciousness to another. When that occurs, we all must put our cards on the table and reveal who we are. We do so personally, on a personal level, and we're doing it on a community and larger level. We are having to choose. We are making sides. And we're being told in advance, okay, do you want to live in a world where if you don't like people, you starve them to death, you just kill them off? That's an option. There's an option which says the opposite. As the Christ consciousness rises, the anti-Christ consciousness will also rise. And we are being shown in very stark terms possible futures, and we have to choose. I just saw an interview, something online, where a young man, he seems to be in his late teens or early 20s, in the state of Israel, spat on a 7-year-old child, spat in his face, and laughed about it, and said his favorite animal is a nigger. The child is an Ethiopian Falasha Jew, and he is an Ashkenazim. There's lots of upset in Israel, which I guess is a good thing, because it means that there are people in Israel, despite the work of the IDF and the government, who have a conscience, who have an awareness beyond themselves, which is not just about themselves. And I think the young man was arrested. But what we are seeing there, and I mentioned that because it is so obvious to me what is happening, that we are being shown a form of consciousness which denies the community of humanity. They regard people who are not like them as animals, who can then be starved, who can be killed, who can be, and it's a reminder to us that that is something that we are all capable of. You and I could have been born Ashkenazim and grew up in that milieu and have that kind of experience. I thank God that I do not. because it's heinous, it's depraved, it's an articulation of what the darkness can be like when we deny and eschew the divine within us. And it is an instructive, So, as we are transitioning from one form of consciousness to another, we have to reveal who we are. During the last Christ consciousness event, the rhetoric used was, unless we confess our sins, we cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. We cannot take our baggage and hope to live in the new world. So we must confess, we must relinquish, and we do that by placing our cards on the table. And to some extent, what is happening in Levant is that the rhetoric today, and it is important to know that, is truth and reconciliation. By telling the truth, we're reconciled to ourselves, to the self which we forgot when we were not telling the truth, and we can move forward in truth. I think that although it might appear on the surface to be riotous and an expression of much which is dark, I am hopeful, because I think that this is a necessary path we must follow. It's like giving birth, as a friend of mine said. You know, it's, if you have witnessed birth, it is a messy affair, but you end up with a living human being with great potential. And I think that what is happening is that we are going through a birth canal. And we are seeing how messy we can be. And we are leaving behind the old skin of what we used to be. And that requires us to face up to what we are capable of doing, both in terms of what is positive and what is negative, so that we may see and choose. And my hope is that we choose wisely and choose for the benefit of the long-term benefit of our species, which is to say, and I'm not neutral about this, we choose the Christ rather than the Antichrist. Thank you.